Hi, and welcome back to Festival of Place Climate Resilience to the session with Peter Apps in conversation about his new book, Homesick. My name is Christine Murray. I'm the director of the Festival of Place and editor in chief of The Developer. The purpose of this event is to come together to learn and align towards a more climate resilience built environment. And today's discussion will look at some of the mindsets and approaches that need shifting in London as the housing crisis meets the climate crisis. Thanks to Civic, who are supporting this event, and to our member organizations who make all our work possible. So Pete and I will be chatting about his book, and I'll be taking your questions for him too. You'll find the Q&A tab on the chat window, so you can please type those questions in at any time. It gives me great pleasure to introduce uh, Peter Apps, a journalist who has held the built environment to account for the Grenfell fire tragedy and continues to challenge and inspire change through his passionate pro-social journalism. Pete Apps is a journalist and author of the Orwell Prize-winning book Show Me the Bodies, which covers the build-up to the Grenfell Tower fire. He spent 10 years writing at industry magazine Inside Housing, and his work has also appeared in The Guardian, The New Statesman, The Times, The Independent, Private Eye, and of course, my little magazine, The Developer. His second book, Homesick, explains how and why the housing crisis has reshaped London. He has also appeared in the Netflix film Grenfell Uncovered, which came out in 2025. So please send an emoji welcome to Peter Apps, who's going to join me on stage. Hi.
Hi, Christine.
So it's a little bit different for us. We normally speak as an editor and a journalist, but today we're going to be chatting as a journalist and a journalist a little bit. But welcome here. It's really great to be speaking to you about this book. I really enjoyed and got a lot out of reading it. So thank you for writing it. I mean, you've written a lot about housing across your career. Why did you decide to write a book about housing in London in particular?
Partly personal. I am a Londoner, as in born and raised Londoner, as well as living in the city now. So, and I've sort of over the span of my life, it's really like a real period of change in terms of London's housing, and it's sometimes um, you can sometimes forget that the sort of past is actually quite close in terms of this wasn't always the way London was. So there's a kind of personal connection to it. There's a kind of city I remember that's not there anymore. But I guess on a broader level, I think the question of London is a really important one, just about the question of cities and how cities are developing. More and more of the world's population live in cities, and numbers going to keep rising. And yet cities are kind of the home of these sort of uniquely difficult housing crises. We obviously, there are housing crises in rural communities and all sorts of housing pressures around the industrialized towns and that sort of thing, but this real kind of financialization of housing, real drive of kind of investment led housing crises seems to be centered on cities. And so London is kind of a good case study of what's also happening in Paris, San Francisco, Sydney. There's a global story here about the way we're living and what it means for us if we can't afford to live in the places where we have to in order to work.
Yeah, and affordability really underpins a lot of the story you share in Homesick. I think what one thing that really struck me, which actually happens in your last book, Show Me the Bodies, shares a lot of personal stories of loss and the kind of experiences of the fire and what was lost in the fire. I mean, it was a book that that really exposed the moral and systemic failures of the industry, but also just this kind of personal tragedy. This book is different, but it also contains many personal stories, both of kind of becoming a Londoner, but then also stories of kind of increasing hardship. But the grief in this book seems to be about the death of London, really, the death of a kind of London that existed, for a generation ago or two generations ago, and seems impossible and unworkable for people arriving now. Is that what kind of encountered? You talked about it not being the London that you were. Is this book about a kind of grief?
Yeah, completely. And I mean, that's where the title comes from. Actually, the original working title I pitched to the editors for this, publishers of this book, was Homesick, the End of London. and we sort of workshopped it to what it is now, which is Housing Project London and how to fix it. But yeah, I mean, the structure of the book is sort of modeled on my first one, i.e., you meet a cast of characters at the start, and then where in Show Me the Bodies, you kind of followed them through the night of the fire. And then for a little bit afterwards, in Homesick, you follow them over 40 years of life in London. And then sometimes you follow their children as well, as their children start to grow up and have very different lives to what their parents experienced. And I think the point that I'm sort of trying to walk a line of not being just overly nostalgic, because London was in a lot of ways quite an unpleasant place in the 1970s and 1980s. And you don't want to just pretend that everything was great then and it's rubbish now. And it's quite a sort of knee-jerk political position to take in 2025. But what you need to tell that story honestly, while also acknowledging that something has been lost. And the thing that's been lost is, in my mind, community and a sense of permanence and a sense of security that London used to offer, to sort of working class, lower middle income people, and then now doesn't. Now it's a struggle to find somewhere to stay. You have to move a lot. You probably don't know people around you. That kind of bond of being part of a community and being part of a broader sense of a rooted community isn't available to people anymore. And my view is that the key change that's driven that is housing, because it's taken away people's ability to stay in a place and to gain some kind of sense of ownership and belonging.
Yeah, and I think you point out there are two personalities in the book, and one, moves to London, lives in some pretty crap housing, but manages to kind of afford it and then manages to buy, and the other one does not prioritize buying. And then you see the generational impact of that one choice, which was not buying when the housing was affordable, and how that is just, it kind of created such a knock-on effect, that goes all the way to their children and their children's children.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the thing is like, that particular person she's a single woman, and she was at a time when it was actually quite hard to get a mortgage as a single woman. So you kind of see how this sort of discrimination can happen. If you just, your life sort of panned out in one way, and you ended up finding a moment of stability and security where you could get a mortgage in the late 80s or early 90s. You're blessed now with security and financial security, and so are your children, which, if your life circumstances just didn't quite play out in that way, you're not. And it's such a defining thing. I think also it's interesting. I try and kind of bring some of those contrasts in. Like, you have an Irish couple, an Irish guy actually, who moves to London in the sort of early 1980s, late 1970s, and works hard. He's a labourer, forms part of an Irish community, has this real kind of sense of security in that, and also is able to buy a house and start a family. And then you have another Irish worker coming to London in 2019, and the complete contrast in their experience. So it's just like, what's changed isn't the individuals and the individual choices. What's changed is the options available to people. And so,
Yeah, and
yeah,
you've done
I
the
think,
same thing where you have teachers who are kind of in the 1980s who are buying the house that they're,
yeah,
buying a home.
exactly.
And then you have teachers who are saying, I have to move out of London and commute in 2 hours every day because it's just completely unaffordable and insecure for me. So I think that's interesting too. It's like a demographic shift. One of the things that really struck me, was around demographics. You talk about this 4% drop in adults. I think they were aged something between 24 and 30 years. It was in that range, and that this is, and then also the school closures that we're seeing, and this real kind of a kind of shift in the age profile of London. Can you talk a little bit about how housing is changing the makeup of the city?
Yeah, no, definitely. So the book is structured in three parts: of past, present, and future. And so the past, we meet these characters and we kind of go through the policy changes. Present, we have a look around at London as it is now, and then in the future, I kind of try and look at some specific things that are going to be different and these things that are changing in London as we kind of move through the 21st century. And the first of those is a changing demographic. So an exodus of people that were previously here that are now moving away. Um, and you know, as you pointed out, there's an increasing rate at which sort of people are coming to the city at a sort of graduate level, possibly renting a room and staying here for a little bit and beginning their career. But then they're increasingly moving away much faster than they would have previously. You know, that process of coming to London as a graduate, getting a job, and then moving out again is a very familiar uh, pattern. It's something people have done for almost as long as London's existed. But what's happening now is that treadmill is speeding up. So people are coming into the city and then moving out again. And then you're also seeing it is there in the statistics. There's quite alarming statistics actually from the Trust for London, who I spoke to for the book, which show it what on its face looks like a positive statistic, which is a fall in London's poverty rate kind of year on year through the 2020s. But when you actually dig into that statistic, it's not showing that people in London are becoming less impoverished. It's showing that poorer people are moving out of the city. So we are starting to do something that London has always done well compared to other cities, is produce a genuinely mixed city. So you can find, you know, and Grenfell Tower is an example of this. You do find rich and poor communities living side by side, and these kind of very mixed up areas. And I mean, people often talk about that in the context of Grenfell being Grenfell Tower was a poor community inside a rich borough, and that's true. But actually, even within Grenfell Tower, it was mixed like that because you had some leaseholders and some private renters who were, you know, affluent, really. I mean, given the value of the flats they owned, and then living alongside, literally living on the same floor as a refugee from Syria who's arrived two weeks previously. And so London did a really good job of just jumbling people up like that. It's very much part of London's character. Um, but what you can see from the data now, it's happening enough that it's actually there in the demographic data, is that that's increasingly no longer the case. The sort of parts of London where you found that kind of lowest income communities are becoming richer. This kind of process of gentrification is really pushing through and pushing people out of the city altogether or to the very edges of it. And then that has a series of implications for, you know, a lot of the people who are moving, whether they're choosing to because they can afford a better option outside the city or they're being forced out, are families, because that's when you need a little bit more extra space. And so London's losing a lot of children. Key worker jobs are becoming much harder to fill, everything from teaching assistants through to doctors even, and pharmacists, and, you know, more kind of private sectory roles, but also ones we can't do without, like dry cleaners and transport workers, and all sorts of people are no longer able to afford to live in London. And so that does raise a question for what kind of city it becomes. I mean, does it end up just one where there is a kind of affluent class of people who have a degree of permanence, and then everybody else is impermanent? So everybody else here is just working for a bit to make a bit of money, and then they're going to go. And if that's the case, what sort of place is it? What does it feel like? And, you know, there's parts of London where that really is how it is now. You know, on the current trends, it looks like that's where the city is going to end up.
I think one of the things that I feel why I felt this exodus look was really important is that that's the bit where if you're a reader who says, well, actually, I don't really care about London. I don't like London anyway. London gets all the news. London's past it. You know, these people are going somewhere, and possibly this hyper treadmill, or this treadmill speeding up, is going to have a knock-on effect to other towns and cities, which then presumably start on this same possible trajectory, maybe slower on a different timeline. But I think you do mention, where do these people go? They're coming into other communities where the perception is that they are raising the rents, they are increasing the house values in those places, and possibly starting this whole chain of events again.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's a fairly clear sort of penny drop effect almost. You have places on the sort of Kent coast has become quite popular for um I guess kind of more white collar Londoners who can work remotely. So places, seaside towns like Deal and Margate and so on. And on the face of it, there's nothing wrong with that. And there are some benefits to those places. You know, seaside towns in England have been struggling because people haven't been going there on holiday. So a boost to the local economy from a series of more affluent people moving there has some benefits. But at the same time, then a lot of houses are being taken up by people who can afford simply have higher budgets, and that has an impact on house prices, which then means people who have a kind of family home there, they maybe can't afford their rent anymore, and their children can't afford to move out, and so you see these pressures spread out from a city. But I think more broadly, the kind of path that London's been on, I chronicle London's journey as distinct from the rest of the UK because I think it's different. But the reason for it has been this kind of very sharp financialization of the housing stock and the desire of investment money to gain a piece of London, whether that's kind of individual landlords or bigger developers, or kind of like the post Thatcher banking system. But that same process will come for anywhere where there's high housing demand. You know, that's the only thing that makes London in terms of that housing pressure, is that it combines that kind of deregulated financialization with high housing demand. And as soon as the housing demand gets high elsewhere, that same thing happens. So no one is insulated from this story wherever you live. And so it is one I think that should matter to anyone wherever they are.
In that future chapter, that's where we run into the climate crisis. How did that come into the story for you? I mean, this seems like, a story of housing affordability, a story of housing policy, a story of many policy failures. The hopeful part of that, as you point out in the book, is, this has all been rather, you know, yeah, this has all happened within 40 years. In theory, we could turn around and do some policies that change our housing policy over the next 40 years. That's the hopeful part of the story. But then the story runs up against the climate crisis. How did that happen for you?
I mean, I think if you're setting out to write about what the future is going to be like, from any perspective in 2025, you have to talk about what the climate's going to be like, because that's going to define all aspects of our lives. So if I was going to talk about a future London, then it was pretty obvious to me that I was going to have to talk about climate change, as in what are the impacts of a hotter climate going to be for us, not just how do we mitigate them. And then the thing is, once you start thinking about London's housing crisis, you start to realize quite quickly the things, the sort of problems that the housing crisis causes, and the issues that have emerged in the kind of more general discussion of housing are actually interlinked with the impacts of climate change, i.e., they're gonna make things worse potentially if there's insecure housing and inappropriate housing, and also the people that are going to suffer the most are people whose housing conditions are or housing rights are the least secure. And so these two issues do link to each other. There's a lot of a lot of housing issues that will become climate issues, and a lot of climate issues that will become housing issues, from insurance through to rehousing people after flooding. And so it felt like you write about the future, you kind of think, what's someone who picks this book up in 20 or 30 years and looks at it going to think of what we said about the future. And it feels like if you hadn't put climate in there as a kind of major part of the story, you're going to look pretty ridiculous in 30 years time, when people are wondering, having the conversations they're going to have then about what the problems are and how to fix them.
I also think it was quite striking because we've laid out this whole um, situation of precarity, extreme precarity, and this idea of the communities that are constantly, you're making friends and they're moving away. There's this sense of community rupture, the fabric of society being really really brittle, really, like really breakable, and fragile. And then you put a crisis on top of it, and you have people who are renting and don't have the agency to necessarily make changes to their homes. You have a kind of sense that people are being, perhaps moved out of social, or moved because of their homelessness or their housing precarity into new places that are, not of their choosing, whether they are in a flood prone or not flood prone. This is kind of lack of choice, lack of stability, and then you turn the heat up, or you turn, the water problems start to happen, and there's just no resilience there. And we're in the context of an event called climate resilience. So, um, did that strike you? This lack of social resilience, like this just inability of this housing situation to just survive a climate crisis at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think firstly, from a kind of very practical perspective, like individual climate resilience is going to be linked to things like, can you afford contents insurance, and can you afford air conditioning? And then that's an affordability question, which also has to do with how much is your rent. And then it also, has to do with how much power do you have over the place you live in. Like, if you're a homeowner, it's quite an easy job to get shutters fitted to keep out the sunlight in the hotter periods of the year. But if you're a tenant, asking your landlord to make that change to the fabric of your property is much harder. Um, and so there's very direct things like that, but there's also a kind of broader social thing in the, you know um, sort of the climate crisis is taking us into a period of disaster. Disasters becoming a bigger part of our lives, but that's actually taking us just a couple of steps backwards. Previous generations have always lived alongside disaster. So London flooded really badly in 1953, for example, and lots of people died. It's a different kind of disaster, but London went through the Blitz, obviously, in the 1940s, and fires and floods have been part of the city's existence. On a tidal river, and it's full of people. Bad things are going to happen. Um, the thing that gets us through disasters as individuals is community. It's the people that we can rely on, the people that we know, the people that will look out for us. The feeling of still being part of that group, that's surviving this and will survive tomorrow. And I think that loss of a kind of spiritual sense of home, before the disaster even strikes, will just make it so much harder for us to be resilient, kind of emotionally and socially, when those things start to become part of our lives again. And again, I think that's related to housing and the fact that we are starting this position, this period of increased risk of disasters, from a position of not having that kind of community network to fall back on.
You cover three main threats to the capital, and I wanted to kind of go through each of them, and also, you posit action points that we should take, actions
Mhm.
that we can take today, or we should be taking. Can you talk a little bit about flooding? I mean, you've mentioned it now, we're on a tidal river, but also there is that increase in rainfall. Can you talk about some of the threats of flooding and what you're seeing that's not happening that was especially concerning in the book?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so London has two flood risks really. One from the rivers and one from the sky. Um, the one from the sky, so surface water flooding, is actually the number one risk to London on the sort of city's risk register. So above terrorism and anything else that you might think immediately when you think of risk to London. And that's because London, increasingly, anyone who's lived here over the last 10 years will see, um, has increasingly experienced these sudden deluges of very, very heavy localized rainfall that suddenly overwhelm the drainage system in a particular area and cause a flood. So the drains back up, the streets flood, and that gets into people's properties. I've lived through a couple of those actually. I've seen kind of like just the street suddenly turn into a river. It happens so fast, which is terrifying. And On one level, the risk of that is sort of property. It's about people, and I don't diminish that because it means people being made homeless. It means particularly for people who are in who have poor landlords. The property's not being dried out properly, so health implications coming after that. The smell and the stench is it's really destabilizing being flooded. But there is also a very direct life risk. I mean, the current working estimate is that a worst case scenario flood happening in the night in an area with a lot of basement flats would cost 40 lives in London. And I've spoken to experts who think the number would be considerably higher than that. And if we're talking about basement flats as well, you've got to think there is almost certainly a link between who is living in a rented basement flat and poverty. It's probably going to lean more that way. There were floods in New York, I think, in 2021, where there were deaths in basement flats. Valencia obviously saw, I think it was 180 people killed recently. And as I understand it, quite a few of those deaths were subterranean. So people were sort of going down to basement car parks to move their car. And suddenly the water came in. And so that surface level flooding is a real problem for London. It's a very difficult one to deal with. We've got a Victorian drainage system that is quickly overwhelmed. And we've made it worse by developing London and taking away the kind of permeable spaces where water might dissolve. The more of the city that's concrete, the bigger the risk of, and tarmac, the bigger the risk of surface water flooding. Then there's the river. London isn't the only city around the world to be on a tidal river, but it's quite unusual to be both on a tidal river and at a point where it's so narrow. So that because that's where we could bridge the river for bridge the Thames. Sorry. So we're obviously protected by the Thames flood barrier. But you guys have run a story, I think, in the Developer a couple of years ago about the risk of a Thames flood barrier failure. The Thames flood barrier was built in the 1980s. It was supposed to last for 70 years, I think, but it's been operating so frequently recently, much more frequently than the original designers expected it to, that it is starting to wear out, and it's probably going to wear out faster than our plans to replace it or repair it, which would be a huge infrastructure project. And we all know how well these infrastructure projects go in London, or in the UK, sorry. If the Thames, if there was a what you call an East Coast storm surge, which is where high sea levels and a high tide flow down the North Sea into that gap in the English Channel, then a lot of that water kind of floods up the Thames. And if that happens at a particular time where there's been heavy rainfall as well, it can it can and has in the past overwhelmed the Thames. And as sea levels rise because of climate change, the risk of that becomes higher. And so there's a potential chance for a flood to get high enough to simply overtop the Thames flood barrier. I think the highest floods in London have been something like 30 centimeters off the top of it. And then there's also a potential for the Thames flood barrier to fail. And the consequences of that would be utterly apocalyptic for London. I mean, you're talking millions of homes affected because of London's not just the Thames, it's kind of subsidiary river network of the River Lee and the River Roding and the Wandle, and all of those places would flood if the Thames flooded. So you would have a very, very, very serious scenario there that would reshape the city. The rebuilding process from that and the restructuring process would be, it would make for a new London. And, there will obviously be lives lost, millions of homes damaged, etc. In terms of what we can do about it, I mean, the trouble with the flooding one is that there are solutions. You can make things, surfaces more permeable. You can, there's adaptations you can make to homes to make them more, less vulnerable to flooding. So sort of waterproof floors on the ground floor and moving plug sockets up to the above where flood waters would reach and all of that kind of thing. Those interventions, though, are quite expensive. You're talking about kind of changing the infrastructure of the city. Permeable pavements are great, but they cost money. And at the moment, even though this issue is a kind of number one risk for London, the strategy to deal with it is very, very piecemeal. I mean, there is a sort of working group on it, and You do see some little projects going in, especially where there's new build activity, to kind of introduce water gardens and you know, areas of more permeable pavement and that kind of thing. But there's no kind of large scale change of our infrastructure. And you know, that kind of really is what the situation demands. There are some things, you know, we talked a little bit previously about, I mentioned basement flooding. I mean, there's no public awareness of a lot of this stuff. You know, like I learned this by researching the book. I didn't know it before, and I'm a housing journalist, right? So there's probably a lot of people who live in basement flats that have got absolutely zero awareness of the risk they would be in if there was a very, very, very sudden surface water flooding event. And just understanding that risk would be a start, you know, in terms of people getting out of those flats quickly. And realizing when they hear the rainfall what could happen, getting above ground level, you know, not going down into the basement car park to get your car out if you think it's about to flood. Those sorts of basic kind of public awareness things would, I think, save lives. And that those ones are almost free. So I think that that's a change that could be easily made. But the broader response to surface water flooding is one that it's a sort of climate adaptation that everyone who knows about climate can tell you we need, but persuading the people who hold the purse strings to invest in it is tougher.
And I think it's one of those things where, you know, working in the built environment, it's like, oh, well, if you're in a floodplain, they don't, you know, make flats and basements anymore. But the
Hmm.
reality is that this might be any Victorian street that have kind of walk up, walk down. They're all across the capital from Kensington to Newham. And they may not realize that just a couple inches on the surface can mean catastrophic flooding into those flats. I really wasn't aware of that. And lots of times I've seen a couple inches on the road and never really thought that that could be flooding into someone's bedroom if that was at nighttime, or that could actually be a threat to life.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that is one of the things that makes surface water flooding so dangerous, is because it's got no overlay with flood risk zones, because the rain can fall anywhere. So the flood risk zones tell you about the river risk, and that's important to consider. But the surface water flooding it will just happen where the rain falls, and it's very, very difficult even to forecast that a day before, because you can say London will see heavy rainfall tomorrow, but exactly which street and which, you know, which hour that's going to happen on, you only really know when it happens. So it's a dangerous risk, you know, and the you know, it's one of these things with the climate where you really do you if you've lived in London over the last 10 years, you have seen this risk increasing because you've seen it happen more. I think it was only yesterday, really. I mean, it didn't get to the stage of surface water flooding, but the rainfall was huge yesterday, you know, like when it really came down. Um, but yeah, I mean, also on the floodplains thing, again, I think this is one I've written for you actually, but there are restrictions on building on floodplains. The Environment Agency gets involved in planning applications all the time and says, we don't think that this is a very good idea, this development. It will be at risk if this river floods, but they get built anyway. And
Yeah.
especially in the current climate of, you know, get rid of planning, get rid of red tape, that's only going to happen more. Um, so there
So
are
there's
going to
a
be
question here, just briefly. I'm going to bring it in because it's relevant to this. Charles Campion, who's a partner at JTP Architects, wants to know if whether there's a need for a basement dweller flood alarm system, such as like signing up to a mobile phone alarm system. Is it too localized to make that possible? You know, would we be able to? Are there alarm systems for this that you know of?
Look, I don't know, but I mean, just in terms of like standing here as a layperson, obviously, it strikes me as a piece of technology that cannot be that difficult to work out.
Yeah.
Um, One thing I would say, which I do know, is that I think it's only since, or no, I'll try and get this right, but I think there aren't the flood rules for basement flats don't take into account surface water flooding risk. You're not allowed to put them in a flood zone, but then beyond that, it's just the kind of same flood rules as we have for anywhere. So it thinks about kind of like escape of water from inside the property and that kind of thing. It doesn't think
Hmm.
about this risk of extreme rainfall coming in, and it's part of this when we'll talk about other bits of the climate change picture. But it's part of this is that building regulations move very slowly, and the climate is changing quite fast. and so we're always behind
Mhm.
where we are in terms of the built environment, and that means we are still creating properties where these risks exist. And if there's, I guess there's a lot of practitioners on the call, but reliance on building regulations is never going to be enough for climate resilience, because the building regulations will have been written at a time when these sorts of risks didn't exist or weren't considered, and they
Yeah.
still are. So
Well, and we can talk a bit about overheating then, because that's one where
yeah.
the building regulations have come in, but you found how they are lacking in many ways. Just to speak to that, Charles, I was just reflecting. My parents in Ontario in Canada will get text messages if there are tornadoes in the area as a weather forecast. So I mean, clearly that is a possible technology that can be regionalized if there was a heavy rainfall in an area. It's not very precise. They've never looked out the window and seen a tornado when they've gotten the warning, but presumably there is one. There is one somewhere nearby. So I want to move to overheating. That's somewhere where building regulations have come in. I mean, also fire, which we're going to discuss as well. But what is it that you discovered about overheating, and why isn't the new Part O sufficient in dealing with it?
Well, I think there are probably things in the new Part O that are good. But I think the thing that really worries me about it is that it only came in 2022. And so that means we've got, we've been building mostly flats in London since the late 1990s. So we've got about 25 years of development of blocks of flats where we haven't been considering overheating at all. And a lot of the decisions we've taken, London flats are overglazed. There's too much glass. There's various reasons for that, but that increases the heating risk. A lot of them are single aspects. So getting a breeze is difficult. Some of them are over insulated, and the Part L regulations can be responsible for that. Insulation can help with overheating, but if it's installed in the wrong way, especially without adequate ventilation, it can be a problem. And then we were talking about this just before we came on. But we've also had a lot of local planning authorities have insisted on district heating networks in developments of blocks of flats, which on the surface are very good ideas, because they should create an efficiency and burn less gas. But the reality is a lot of those have been really poorly installed, and they leak heat. So if you go into a block of flats in
All
London, even in
year.
this, yeah, all year. I mean, well, as soon as someone is wanting having a hot shower, so long as the gas is burning, some of these things operate at efficiency levels as low as 15%. So only 15% of the gas is heating up the water that someone's using, and the other 85 is just escaping around the building and producing heat in communal areas and heat in flats that don't want it. And so I spoke to an academic who'd done some research into a student housing block in Tottenham, where they found that kind of unhealthy levels of heat, the heat temperature, especially at night, exceeded healthy levels for something like 30 or 40% of the night, when it's considered unhealthy if it goes above those levels for just 1% of the night. And that was a combination of all of those things. And one of the things that really worries me at the moment is that there's already a pushback against the Part O stuff. The builders are saying, well, dual aspect flats are very expensive, and we're starting to build in a reliance on air conditioning, which is a very dangerous thing to do, because again, it assumes that everyone will be able to afford that, which is making an assumption about people's individual circumstances and electricity prices, which I wouldn't be comfortable making. Britain is not a country which has we don't, air conditioning would be an additional cost for most of us. We don't have air conditioning now, and household budgets are just not in a place where they'll be able to get that. And also private landlords unlikely to be willing to spend the money installing these systems and maintaining them. So it's a kind of new version of the sort of fuel poverty conversation we have now about people being cold in the winter is very much going to become being too hot in the summer. And London is most at risk from this part anywhere in the UK, because it has the highest number of the highest concentration of blocks of flats where overheating is the biggest risk, and it also has the hottest temperatures in the UK already, because it's a huge urban heat island, and it's in the southeast of England, so it's already hotter than everywhere else. So London is consistently sort of 2 or 3 degrees hotter than the rest of the UK, sometimes considerably more than that. And its housing is extraordinarily badly adapted for that. And then again, there is also a poverty thing, because something else I talk about in the book and is the kind of very, very high levels of temporary accommodation and homelessness in London. And a lot of that temporary accommodation is in sort of office to resi conversions. And I've spoken to doctors who think that they're already seeing sort of very young children who are living in that kind of TA type accommodation coming in with heat stress into sort of London hospitals and so on in the summers. So yeah,
Yeah,
unfortunately,
children
that
are
is,
very highly affected by overheating.
yeah, children.
Are
It's
there
the two most vulnerable points in life when you're old and when you're young is when overheating is the highest risk.
you've spoken in the book about how there are behavioral changes here too, like as with the kind of flooding, there is an awareness about how people can use your flats. And many of these office to residential conversions, especially those that lack openable windows or a single aspect, are very poorly converted. There isn't really that much behavioral change that you can do, but you did speak to kind of people understanding around keeping the sun out, or there being a cultural kind of adaptation to how to live in a hot place.
Totally. I mean, and I think this is part of the issue with London and climate change is we're sort of moving from being a cold Northern European city to being a sort of hot Southern European city. That's kind of what's happening to our climate. And we don't have the kind of just cultural knowledge that comes with having grown up in Lisbon or Madrid or whatever. Like, yeah, I've grown up in London. Most Londoners I grew up with think you just open the windows when it's hot, right? And like, you don't understand the ideas of just kind of like opening the door and ventilating the house when it's cold, and cooler air in the morning, and then bringing the shutters down when this on the south facing side of the house when the sun's on the windows. But that's second nature to people in hotter countries. But English people haven't had to learn that, but we're going to have to. So there is a degree, like with the flooding, there is a degree of, we can't take this problem away. It really needs kind of changes to the fabric of the city. But you can mitigate it a bit by just making it easier for people to understand how to keep their homes cool. And I would like to see more of that.
I know I had friends who went to visit a family and they just don't cook. I mean, it was in kind of a Mediterranean country, and they just don't cook hot food in the house except at night, and they eat it cold the next day. Just
Mhm.
like kind of real cultural adaptation. Just is basically you don't roast anything, you don't boil anything, you don't turn the cooker on
Yeah.
because you're going to heat up the house. So, but I think that behavior only goes so far, and you talk about who's going to pay for these adaptations, who's going to pay for the shutters, who's going to pay for the air conditioning, who's going to pay for changes to our infrastructure. I think you don't answer that question completely.
Well, no, and unfortunately, I don't, because there isn't an easy answer to it. I think if you live in a house and you are the individual homeowner of that house, then you probably will. People spend a lot of money on home improvement, and so they probably will spend that money improving their house from a overheating perspective. But if you're a tenant of a room in a house, or you're even a leaseholder in a block of flats where actually this needs to be done to the whole building, not just your flat, and you don't necessarily have the right to install shutters on the outside, nor would that be a simple job. It's not clear in the slightest who's going to pay for this. And it sometimes feels a little bit. It's sort of like you come to a story as a journalist, and you're almost obliged to offer solutions if you're going to raise a problem. But sometimes the job of a journalist is to say there isn't actually a good solution to this. There's not an easy answer. And this is, a lot of the stuff in here is, I mean, like, we have built a city that is not going to, we bequeathed one because it was cold, and we're increasingly built one over the last 25 years that's not going to do very well in hot climates. And that has given us a problem. That, combined with the amount of carbon we've burned, has given us a problem to which there aren't easy solutions. And
You're
yeah,
allowed to just ask the questions, but there is a
yeah,
question
right.
here from Michelle Morrison, who's from Advanced Northumberland, who wants to know all the answers in regards to the financialization of the housing market. I'm going to tell you, you have to buy the book for those, because they are at the end. There are a bunch of proposals. I'm sure Pete
Right.
will appreciate me giving a plug to buy that. But there is a chapter of ideas to fix it that are not necessarily definitive, but proposals and examples from elsewhere. So throughout the book, actually, there are examples from other cities taking steps to, and it's not one thing. There's no one single silver bullet, but you do make the point that London is very well placed to solve some of these um, problems because of the amount of land and housing that it already owns. So I think that is a very powerful and salient point that you make. I wanted to move to fire. You know, on first glance, there's no real connection to the cladding crisis. We think perhaps to the issue of fire, but actually in the book that is, you know, it's not entirely clear. And fundamentally, the cladding of Grenfell was supposed to be an energy efficiency move. It was supposed to be a kind of positive retrofit that was interconnected with the cladding crisis. Um, but you talk about fire in the context of Grenfell, but you also just talk about fire in the context of wildfire, which is not something that we would ever associate with London or even England. It's quite rare to consider that a threat. Why is that a growing threat? And what's the connection to the cladding crisis?
Um, I mean, it is a very serious growing threat, unfortunately, in London. I mean, we've had it was on the outskirts of London, but in 2022, when we had a 40-degree day in London, we had, I think, a whole street destroyed by wildfire. Um, and the problem is kind of alluding back to my previous answer in that London is moving from being one type of climate to another. And so it has a kind of green nature, which is one of the best things about London. You know, there's real kind of foresty areas of the city and loads of parks and all of that, and loads of trees on the streets, which you wouldn't find in a hotter city, because they wouldn't have been planted. And if they had been planted, they would have probably burned by now. Um, and there is also a very close link, like proximity between areas of kind of grassland and forests and very densely populated areas. So you Wanstead Flats, which I think I mentioned in the book, is a big grassland in the east of the city. Very nice place to go and have a picnic. Very close to one of the most densely populated parts of the city in Newham. And Wanstead Flats has burned 3 times over the last 3 years. You know, it's you know, I've driven across that where it's completely blackened because a wildfire got out of control and couldn't be stopped. Now, if that had happened on a day with wind high enough to carry those embers over the road and into the built environment, you would have started to lose houses because the embers would go in through windows, they would go down chimneys, they set cars on fire, and you would suddenly start to have a spreading urban wildfire of the kind that we saw in Los Angeles or Hawaii. And there are lots of parts of London where that risk exists. You know, there's some detailed research which I cite in the book, which shows what this research into what they call fire waves in London. So a certain degree, being over a certain threshold in terms of temperature, and then below a certain threshold in terms of humidity. So when the air is dry and when the weather is hot, there is this peak in fires starting it on green areas, whether that be a back garden or a park or a grassland, and then spreading into an urban environment. And it's so closely correlated that I mean, it surprised the academics even who pulled that data and analyzed it. But again, those conditions are going to increase. The good thing about that, though, is because that data is so clearly correlated, it does become more predictable than surface water flooding. You can look at this and say, if we have 5 days of humidity below X and temperature above Y, we will see wildfires in London. And so you can prepare like that. And there's a huge case for public awareness in that instance. You know, just telling people, today is maximum fire risk day. Do not have a barbecue in the park. Do not have a barbecue in your back garden. Don't flick a cigarette. Don't leave grass lying on a piece of grassland because the sunlight coming through it could start a fire. And the London
So
Fire
like
Brigade
a
are
hose pipe ban, you know, we're so accustomed to
right.
hose pipe bans
Barbecue
now in
ban,
London.
exactly. Yeah, and the
Yeah,
London Fire Brigade
yeah.
is scaling up for wildfires. I mean, it's buying equipment and getting training from other parts of the world where this is much more common. But then there is also there's the wider question of just fire, full stop. So not a wildfire starting elsewhere. It's just a fire starting inside a flat, a domestic fire. And you know, obviously that's a point of kind of real interest to me, given the work I've done on the Grenfell Tower fire. And it's a funny one that, and we talked about this previously when before we had the call, because when I've spoken to fire engineers and people who understand fire, there's not necessarily a good answer as to why a hotter day and a hotter climate would mean a higher risk of fire. Sometimes you could have light coming in through a window or something, but that's quite rare. Um, but it does seem to be connected. Grenfell was in June. The Lacanau House fire, which was sort of similar to Grenfell but lower scale, was in July. We lost another building in London, the Spectrum building, last year. Well, thankfully, no one died, and that was in August. And if you look at a lot of these really big building fires, they are clustered, not exclusively, but mainly in that period of high summer, so June, July, August. And I just can't believe that's a coincidence. There's too many of them. And because I report on these things, I kind of see when if one of these things happens, I notice it. And it was true this year as well. There were 3 or 4 big building fires in London, and I think the last one was in kind of early September.
Mm.
But it's that period of the year. And when we had the 40-degree day, yes, there was the wildfire, but there was dozens of other instances around London. The London Fire Brigade said it was their busiest day in London since the Blitz. And I can't believe that's a coincidence. So I think, does seem to be this causal link, even if not fully explained, of just an increasing number of fires happening. And now we've got, again, all these things with the climate sort of interact. We electric bikes, electric scooters, and so on the one hand, great way of getting around a city, very green, excellent form of transport. On the other hand, an enormous fire risk, especially if they're taken right inside people's homes. And with those, the batteries, certainly if they're overheating, are going to become more vulnerable to combustion. So more fire, unfortunately, is part of London's future too. And I think you were right to note that at the start. A lot of the plastic insulation that we've installed on people's homes in order to hopefully mitigate the climate crisis by burning less gas, then adds to the fire risk. And so I think for people designing buildings and discussing climate solutions, those solutions need to be discussed. And I think also about timber construction and that sort of thing. Those solutions need to be discussed with an understanding that this building is going to live through a period of heightened fire risk, and it needs to survive that. And if the climate solution you're proposing doesn't take that into account, then it's no solution at all, really.
I think it's interesting we look at the kind of direction of travel. We talked about rain gardens. We talked about, I mean, certainly we talk a lot about shade in terms of overheating, about the use of tree canopies, to kind of cool the city or reduce the urban heat island effect. You make the point in the book that, having these things abutted against very highly populous areas, or understanding how they do this in hotter places because they are aware of the fire risk, whereas we're kind of going towards a more furry landscape design that may be shied away from in places where a flick of a cigarette, would actually make a difference to that courtyard, in the middle of a very busy housing development that's chosen to have a kind of grassland look and feel. I think that we've starting to become accustomed every summer of these images coming out of places like, Greenwich and Hampstead Heath with, a completely yellow landscape that was never seen before, the green and pleasant land becoming this kind of
Mm,
golden vista. Um, so I don't know. I don't know if I have a point to conclude, but I think there is a point in the book, which is, look to these other places, look to these other cities, look to see what they are doing and how they are already facing these risks. They are already dealing with these climate impacts,
yeah.
and how are they doing it?
Right. I mean, like London is transitioning to a hotter climate, and but it is not going to be hotter than Lisbon and Marrakesh and all of these other places. So these kind of conditions there are architects out there, and there are communities out there that understand these issues, and we can learn lessons from them about how to adapt. But I think it's understanding. I think that not all of these problems we are going to go into a hotter world, however well we do at dealing with it, we are going to go into a hotter world, and some realism about that, in terms of the design, and consideration of that in terms of the design, I think would be really beneficial, because the buildings you build shouldn't be built for a 2025 climate. They should be built for a 2075 climate, because they're supposed to last that long. And so I think that's, if there's a takeaway message from me for designers, who I guess I'm speaking to mostly at the moment, it's build buildings for a hotter world, because they're going to have to live through one.
Pete, I just want to thank you for being here, for all the work that you do as well. I mean, I think your journalism has really held this industry to account in a way that I appreciate greatly, and I know many of us do. So I hope your story on the current heat districts, heating districts and district heating, I should say, comes to fruition. I look forward to reading that, and just thank you for being here and being part of this event.
Cheers, Christine. Thanks for inviting me.
The book is called Homesick: How Housing Broke London and How to Fix It. It's available now. We've included a link, actually, in the chat to an independent bookstore where you can get your copy. That brings this event and this session to a close. If you would like to watch any of the talks back from the last 2 days, the event portal will stay open. You'll be able to log in and access them. If you have a colleague who's also a member organization, they can sign up and watch those talks back as well. So do recommend them to others. Thank you to our organization members for supporting this event, and to Civic for partnering with us to bring this to you. Thanks for all your questions and participation in the chat and in the Q&A. If you love this event, you will love our in-person Festival of Place on the 10th of June, where we will bring this community together face to face. But before that, we'll be together in the new year for Festival of Place Social Impact, where we'll bring you 6 more sessions of interesting speakers talking about how we can make a positive social impact through our work. Thanks for being here, and see you soon.